Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer announced last week, you probably read or heard something about it, that he will retire from the High Court after serving there for more than 27 years. But his decision comes after a year-long campaign pressuring him to step down and make way for President Biden to name a new nominee. Liberal activists were motivated in part by the experience of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She died in 2020 and was replaced by President Trump's third and final confirmed conservative nominee to the court, Amy Coney Barrett. One of the groups that urged Breyer to consider stepping down was Demand Justice. It even drove a truck around the Supreme Court building with a billboard reading, "Breyer Retire." Joining me now to discuss all this, Brian Fallon. He's the executive director of Demand Justice. So, Brian, welcome to the show. It's good to have you. Was advocating publicly for Breyer to retire necessary?
Well, I'm not sure we'll ever know the answer to that question. I think that we just felt strongly about two things, Major. One was we didn't feel like we could afford to greet this situation passively, that we'd seen what happened with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat. We all, as progressives, live to regret her decision to not retire when we had a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. And we worried that people would just mostly sit on their hands and cross their fingers with respect to Justice Breyer. Second, we were trying to make a larger point, separate from Breyer, which is that the Supreme Court as an institution and the individual justices should not be treated as off limits. This is an institution that is increasingly behaving in a political fashion. The appointees to the High Court are increasingly being discussed in campaigns. Donald Trump, as you know, famously promised that anybody he appointed would overturn Roe v. Wade. So this is an issue that Democrats can't afford to treat as separate from politics anymore. And we didn't think that this old school vision of not being able to call into question a Supreme Court justice staying on the court past the right moment politically, we didn't feel like that should be treated as off limits. And I think in general, Democrats need to get more willing to discuss the Supreme Court and its political ramifications. We're heading for a June end of term period where there could be huge decisions looming that have huge reverberations for the midterm elections. And so the sooner that Democrats are willing to talk about the court in political terms, the better off we'll be.
And to be clear, Brian, this was not, as I gather it, about Justice Breyer's fitness or ability to carry out the obligations of being an associate justice on the Supreme Court. It was about who is the president and what is the composition of the U.S. Senate, correct?
Absolutely. We did not have problems with Justice Breyer's jurisprudence. We just were pointing to the fact that Senator Mitch McConnell, Senator Chuck Grassley were going around openly saying that if they flip the Senate in 2022, they might not confirm any justice that President Biden might name at that point, that they might essentially run the Garland strategy against any future nominee from any Democratic president. And so we thought that that made it a necessity politically for Justice Breyer to consider the timing of his retirement and to avail himself of this brief window of time that we have. And I'll just add that in the few days since Justice Breyer announced his retirement, you've seen a senator from New Mexico suffer a stroke, and he's not going to be able to return to the Senate to vote for 4 to 6 weeks, which just further emphasizes how fragile this 50-seat Democratic majority is. And this is why I think it's wise that Senator Schumer and the White House are signaling that they're going to move quickly here.
For some, Brian, this might strike them as a turnstile moment, meaning once you've gone through it, you can't go back. The idea of activist groups on either side of the political spectrum, right or left, actively campaigning for someone sitting on the bench with a lifetime appointment to get off according to their timetable. Walk me through why that's a good idea and healthy for our system.
Well, I think that we on the Democratic side have been the victim of a more strategic approach being taken to the Supreme Court by Republicans over the last several decades. I already mentioned, the play that Mitch McConnell ran to block Barack Obama from filling Antonin Scalia's seat, even though we were a year out from the election. But just to give another example, in the twilight of Donald Trump's tenure as president in the closing months of 2020, Senator McConnell was going around calling appeals court judges, asking them to retire so that the Senate could act to fill that vacancy before Donald Trump's time in office potentially ended with the 2020 election. And not only did he do that, he wasn't quiet about it either. They talked about it to the press. The New York Times wrote a whole story about it. And Republicans largely patted themselves on the back about how strategic an approach that was. And so in the face of that, I don't think Democrats should anymore be treating the courts with kid gloves and be essentially surrendering the third branch of government to the Republican Party. That's what's gotten us into the situation where we're staring down this end of term June period where we could be seeing huge rulings on issues ranging from abortion to gun safety to climate change. And they just decided they're going to hear an affirmative action case potentially next term. So there's huge priorities that have huge consequences for progressives that are looming here that are probably going to be bad rulings in our eyes because of the 6-3 court. And I think it's time that we shift our approach if we ever want any chance of having a fair shake when these cases go through the courts.
And for those listening to you, Brian, I think I know the answer to this, but when you talked about this decades-long strategic approach, I think what you're saying is the reason the court is 6-3 now is because about 30 years ago, Republicans set their eyes on that.
Right. So a lot of progressives got complacent over the last few decades, Major, because during the middle part of the 20th century, you had the Warren Court era that, everybody studies in school about Brown versus Board of Education.
Which sparked its own political backlash on the right a little bit.
Exactly. So in response to that period around the middle of the 20th century, you had a conservative movement that sprang up and worked for 40 years to retake the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And they organized in the form of groups like the Federalist Society, which I look at with admiration in terms of the ruthlessness with which they've approached their task, which is to create a pipeline of jurists that they know would be confident, would side with them on issues related to workplace issues in favor of corporations, and then on social issues like abortion and guns. And they've successfully mobilized their base to vote for politicians based on commitments that they make about the types of judges that they'll confirm. And on our side, we just haven't had that same fluency politically in talking about the courts and emphasizing it to our voters. I think the pendulum, unfortunately, is about to swing back because now Republicans have succeeded in getting this 6-3 majority on the court. They're about to get rulings that they've fought for decades to achieve. And now I think it's going to be our side that is going to be galvanized in response.
So, simple question. Should Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments?
I don't think so. And that's an issue that I think that there's starting to be a bipartisan consensus on. President Biden, as you may know, appointed a commission last year to take a look at various Supreme Court reform proposals. One of the ideas that they studied was term limits. There was a belief among people that were Republican-aligned professors and scholars, as well as Democratic-aligned academics, that there'd probably be a lot of wisdom to having term limits for Supreme Court justices. And so that's a proposal that a group like mine would support, in addition to other proposals. I think in general, the way that our elected branches of government have been sort of mired in dysfunction, it has made the judicial branch way more powerful than the founders ever intended. They're settling almost every political dispute in America today, are not being resolved at the ballot box or on the hall in the floors of Congress. They're being resolved by unelected jurists. I don't think that's what the founders intended, and I think increasingly there's going to be a public backlash to that. So I hope when this pendulum swings back, it won't just be a 40-year effort to get quote unquote Democratic favored judges appointed to the bench, but there'll actually be a serious policy debate about structural reforms that we can pursue that will make the court considerably less powerful vis-a-vis the elected branches. I think that's what we need. And both sides, I think, should be able to come to agreement on that.
Your organization has called for basically an ethics code for Supreme Court justices. Briefly, what is it? And do you think it should apply not only to sitting justices, but to their spouses?
So there's been a lot of reporting of late of conflicts that have seemed to have been created for Clarence Thomas, one of the Supreme Court justices whose wife, Ginny Thomas, is highly involved in Republican politics and an advisor to many groups that were very closely aligned with the Trump administration. And there's been some great reporting by Jane Mayer at The New Yorker about how Ginny Thomas, is involved with many organizations that have business before the court. And I think that's one example of how bad it is that the Supreme Court right now is not governed by any kind of code of ethics. It is the only judicial body in America that is not covered by any type of code of ethics. At the federal level, the lower courts, if you're a district court judge, if you're a circuit judge, there are rules of the road in terms of disclosures that are mandatory, in terms of trips that you can't take, gifts that you can't accept, conflicts of interest policies that govern cases, whether you should be able to hear a certain case if there's a certain plaintiff involved. At the Supreme Court, it's the wild, wild west. Each justice gets to make their own judgment calls about whether it's appropriate for them to sit and hear a case, even if they have direct interests in the case. We leave it up to them to decide whether they feel they're conflicted or not. Justices notoriously go on junkets, take funded trips to make appearances. Antonin Scalia famously died while he was on a hunting trip in Texas at an all expenses paid junket, essentially, where all kinds of influence is brought to bear on these justices. And there's no system for having to disclose that, let alone recusing yourself from cases that might involve these third-party actors that take you on these trips. So absolutely we need a code of ethics. That's another one of the another one of the systemic reforms I think both sides should be able to agree to.
Brian Fallon, Executive Director of Demand Justice, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Major.